So welcome to Lancefield on the Line, and welcome to Chris Rangen. Chris is an entrepreneur, innovator, teacher, advisor, strategist, board member, and many other things, including an eminent skier and surfer. Chris, welcome to the show.
David, thank you very much. And I think you forgot to say snowboarder as well. So just add that to the list.
I do apologise, and yes, and that's not one of the things I can claim to. But yes, I'm sure there's other things you do in your 24-hour working. Chris, you're somebody who I've been inspired by for quite a while now and collaborated with, luckily. And today we're going to cover a smorgasbord. I had to throw that one in, of topics from scaling to strategy, simulations, transformation, ecosystems, the frontiers of practice and thinking in all things management. So let's get cracking. As I said, you've been involved in investing, building, advising companies from pre-seed to IPO. That's a huge track record, and it's a great set of stories that we'll no doubt talk about today, and I'll share some links separately in the notes. Simple question to start off with. When you think about scale-ups and scaling businesses up, whatever stage, what are the most important ingredients that the entrepreneurs and leaders need to master?
Well, David, that is a broad question to serve with the smorgasbord. And I think there are many different angles and answers to the question. One of the most important ones is the ability to think strategically, which I know we share a lot of passion and interest around. Because one of the big downfalls I see from many founders is they tend to think too short term. So for example, they're putting way too much thinking into their immediate product launch or their immediate funding round, where in reality, you need to think about the long-term impact of decisions today and how they will materially impact your business into the future. So helping founders think more strategically and thinking more long-term is something that I think is really important for early stage companies.
What about the, I buy that completely, and we'll probably come back to that topic a bit later when we think about sort of strategy thinking and some of the tools that you've pioneered. But what about some of the, if you like, more personal practices of leaders? Because I see leaders who have the right intent, some have that strategic mindset, but they don't necessarily last the course. You know, they get bored, they get distracted. I'm just conscious in terms of some of the leadership characteristics beyond strategy that some of the most successful scale-up leaders have mastered. What else would be on your list?
Well, one thing I've noticed with some of the most successful founders that we've been backing and working with is they don't sit still very much and they don't walk very slow. So
Yes.
I picked up this from one of them. You know, I never walk one step at a time or one step of stairs at a time. I always naturally leap and bound 3 steps, 4 steps, whatever. Because who has time for walking at a regular pace in a flight of stairs? And I think that was a beautiful way of seeing a lot of the high quality founders that we see and we work with. They have this urgency of not just all the things that they need to do. It's not that they're busy people per se, but there's so much that needs to get done, and they need to get this speed and momentum and bring that speed and momentum into their teams. So it's about the urgency and the drive, the passion for action, getting stuff done.
I see that in you as well. How does that sit with the emphasis that a lot of people put on the need for reflection? So sort of, yes, urgency, yes, driving things forward yourself and your business, but also the time to pause and reflect. Do they do that as well? Or is it less important than perhaps some people emphasize?
No, I think it's very important. I think, again, smart business leaders, whether you're building a unicorn or whether you're building a large corporate in a transformation, the ability to step back and reflect is very important. But, you probably shouldn't be spending most of your day reflecting on a daily basis.
Yes.
So having the ability to execute fast while also sometimes step back and reflect, absolutely important, David.
Yeah. Now, you talked a little bit, you gave a glimpse of what you're doing, and I recognise that you're a board member at a number of organisations at Zabtec, Solar Duck, and your own venture fund, Link Capital. So you're in the business of doing as opposed to just advising, which is fantastic. When those boards or others you've been involved in have been on their best form, so they've been doing a great job as a board, what have they been doing well?
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant question, David. And I think the relationship between founders / management and board of directors is an incredibly complex. It's relatively poorly understood, largely. And I think that a lot of work and a lot of thinking should go into building and optimizing that relationship between management and board. Now, when it comes to high performance boards, I think there's a couple of things. First, the board members really need to understand the landscape and the business. So you don't have to be a technical expert or an engineering expert per se, but you need to have the large helicopter view of the landscape and where the business fits in. So that's first. The second, I think a founder recently said a good board exists 3 years ahead of the founders or 3 years ahead of the management team. So if the management team is busy executing this week, this month, and this quarter, while the board should be thinking strategically up to 3 years ahead. So seeing the landscape, 3 years strategic view on the business, and then finally making sure that the board really respects the working space the management team needs, or the founders need. So finding that, it's kind of a delicate balance between how much do I step into the business as a board member,
Yes,
as opposed to how much do I become a strategic coach or a supporter. But then there's also, sometimes a board member needs to step in and be much more firm, much more direct, much more on the short-term financing. So the role of a board member will quite commonly change and shift quite dramatically based on where the business is in its life cycle. So it's a beautiful and kind of complicated relationship that I think deserves a lot more attention than we're currently seeing.
yeah, it's a high bar you set there for board members, and it's quite a contrast to, if you like, the reputation and stereotypes of some board members, where they spend a lot of their time on process and rules and governance. And if you said that helicopter view, that they don't have it, or they focus on getting into the operational matters, or quite short-term perspectives on around the organisation. So I think that's quite a challenge for many board members, because they haven't grown up with those skills and capabilities. They've grown up in quite a governance-led set of capabilities. So that's quite a shift.
But also, David, I mean, if you look at the large majority of publicly listed companies, they have profoundly experienced management, they have governance structures, they have all the reporting mechanisms set up. So by the time you get to serve as a board member for a well-established public company, the role for a board member is more on the controlling side, more on the reporting and the governance side. And you think, well, business is good and life is stable until you realize, your business actually is running into a brick wall called industry transformation. So the board, again, needs to change how it's working.
Yeah. They sort of can be, I guess they can be focusing on the day-to-day, feeling comfortable how they are, but there are either headwinds that they're not even capturing or facing, or disruptive competitors they're not tackling. Let's continue that theme, because you are one of the few people who spends your days and occasionally nights, depending on the time zone, with large corporates, as you just mentioned, as well as startups and scale-ups, and often combined. If you had to walk out of the room physically or virtually from, say, a corporate, let's start with the corporate first, and then you walked into relatively early stage scale-up, what lessons or insights would you be taking from the corporate world that the scale-up can learn from? And then we'll turn the tables in a moment.
That's a good question. So I think there's more similarities. There's more learning that can be transferred than maybe most people think. Because even though they are fundamentally different, I mean, I know you had Steve Blank on your show recently, and they're fundamentally different entities and creatures. You're still working with people, you're still working with customers, you're still working with value creation, you're still working with with optimizing limited resources. But some of the key learnings that I would take from a corporate into a startup is really thinking about what does our company look like as we scale? What is the processes? What are the strategies that we have in place? What are the risks? For example, today most companies struggle with supply chain risks coming out of China.
Yes.
And how do we minimize those risks? A lot of these things, a typical startup founder team won't always have the experience or the bandwidth or the focus to handle all those things. So there's absolutely key learnings that you can take from big company coming into a smaller, early stage company.
And then if you turn the tables, having been in a large consultancy and worked with a lot of large corporates, you often hear the phrase or the sentiment, come on, be more entrepreneurial, act like a startup founder, which at one level is quite energizing and exciting. It's quite a challenge as well. But it sort of leaves you with a sense of, what does that actually mean? Do you buy into that concept of, act more like a founder if you're in a large company? Does that help or does it hinder?
Well, first of all, I think it's a terrible misuse of the English language. Because
so says a Norwegian who speaks better English than most of us. Brilliant.
It would translate equally poorly. Whenever you have let's say that you have an executive. Let's say that he or she manages a company with a few thousand employees. And then he or she may say something like, hey guys, we need to be more entrepreneurial. You need to act more like startups or startup entrepreneurs. That is the biggest hoax ever, because a startup founder would have all of the upside or most of the upside if the company goes well. So if you are a startup founder and you're raising a couple of rounds of financing, you may still preserve 50, 60% of your equity ownership. If the company does well, you will be swimming in cash. And you'll walk away potentially with hundreds of millions in your bank account.
Yeah.
So whenever a corporate CEO says, let's be more entrepreneurial, let's work more like startups, they never mean to give you the upside that a startup founder would be able to. And I know a lot of companies have been struggling with this. How do we allocate for corporate level equity? Do we do spin outs? Do we do sandboxes? Do we allow some of our employees to kind of take their companies out and retain some level of corporate ownership? But I think that's the weak link where a lot of big companies realizes it's cool to talk about let's be more entrepreneurial, but actually doing it in practice within the governance frameworks and the legal frameworks and the financial frameworks of a big company, not so easily available. So I
agree with that. I agree with that because both of my previous organisation had a lot of innovation capital, for a consultancy at least, and a lot of people involved in it. And there was fantastic activity, and it was more than theatre, but it was bounded. So they were still measured on similar measures to the more traditional aspects of the organisation. And so when there was an upside, their direct return from it and or the risks they were taking, again, was pretty well bounded. And so the question would be, was it good for the organisation to play in that space? Yes, it was. But how close was it to the real thing? Question mark.
Yeah. Now, in fairness, David, there are mechanisms, and we've worked with several clients that are experimenting with some of these mechanisms. So, for example, I take a big oil and gas energy company that wanted to explore some radically new business areas. And it started with internal hackathons for an ideation format. We spun those ideas from a hackathon into early stage internal innovation projects. So far, so good. And then we had a few months, and I worked with the teams very, very, very closely. We had a few months to really go out and validate, test, conceptualize. And when they came back, they basically said, we have proven market interest. We have an early concept. We have a roadmap and a game plan for what this needs to look like. And then they spun that out where the corporate had a majority ownership. And they took the new entity and they listed it as a separate standalone business, where the founders/management retained some of the equity positions. So you had corporate ownership, you had public ownership, and you also had some of the founder/management. So there are proven models, David, that we have.
Yeah, it is
seen
possible.
and have implemented.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it's difficult.
Let's continue that theme, because corporate venture capital is a hot topic in many organisations. It's not necessarily a new concept, but it's practiced more. And I know from executives I'm working with, they've dabbled with it, or they're more interested in doing it properly. Tell us a bit more, because I know that's one of your hot areas yourself and an area of expertise. Tell us a bit more, for those who don't know much about corporate venture capital. What is it? And very importantly, how do you make it work?
Those are some million, if not billion-dollar questions, David. So
Of course,
let's
that's why I'm asking of you.
Thank you very much. So this is the stage where I would love to have a big whiteboard and go up and start sketching and mapping this out. But I'll try to keep it short and concise. So I think that we should view corporate venture capital either through the strategy lens or through the innovation lens. And the starting point you choose takes you on a little bit different path. But if we go with the innovation lens, so applying what is commonly known as Cisco's strategy framework for innovation, you have build, buy, partner, co-invest, and co-develop. These are the different innovation options available to you. Now, one of those options, co-invest, is also what we call corporate venture capital. And corporate venture capital is pretty simple, that you allocate a certain amount of money for investing into or co-investing into early stage companies that have both a strong financial reason, but even more so a big strategic reason. So far, so good.
Yes.
Now, the challenge is that the large majority of people that work in this space, they do not have sufficient relevant experience understanding early stage companies, scouting, negotiating, dealing with the terms, and they do not have sufficient experience to bring those things back to the mothership, if you will, on how do we implement these concepts or these ideas at a scale that makes sense. Now, having seen what's been happening, especially within the European corporate venture landscape over the last, give or take, 5-6 years, there's really an explosion of new corporate venturing teams, playbooks, recommendation tools, canvases, and like you mentioned, we have been developing a large amount of content and case studies and playbooks for corporate venture teams. And I think that what we're seeing now, just like we've been hoping and hypothesizing, is that if you do this well, a corporate venture capital strategy can be a core tool both in your strategy toolbox and also in your innovation toolbox.
That's a great articulation. I've got so many questions, but I'm going to just pick one or two. If as a corporate you've grown up with what you might call more traditional forms of innovation, so more sustaining innovation on your product or service mix, how do you combine what could be described as a broader innovation portfolio to now include corporate? Because I see in different contexts people, if you like, running, to your analogy earlier, running and sprinting to the new shiny thing, which is the corporate venture capital. And then the question is, well, what about all the rest of the innovation you're doing across your organization? So it begs the question of how do you build it all together? How do you bring that coherence and cohesion?
Yeah. Well, some would say that maybe you don't. Maybe managing innovation too tightly actually becomes, the opposite of what you wanted to achieve. But second, what you're really implying here, David, is the need for a structured innovation portfolio management philosophy. And of course, most companies have. Many companies practice something else, what they have in their governance. But I think it always makes sense to develop a high level, so the helicopter view again, high level innovation portfolio management. And then you'll have different activities or different working streams or different projects within those. And of course, you need to balance a certain amount of your resources for your core improving, cost-cutting, efficiency-driven innovations, and that's perfectly fine.
Yes.
How do we do more with less, and how do we increase our margins in a very, very competitive market? And that's perfectly fine. But a corporate venture capital strategy should not be a very large piece of the innovation mix. It should be fairly substantial as and if you prove and validate what you're doing. But to begin with, and for a reasonable period of time, it should be a relatively small amount of your financing, of your headcount, of your focus that goes into the CVC space, because there are so many other areas of innovation that also needs to be covered within the organization. So finding that balance, I think, is really, really critical.
That's a great point. So if you're a member of a team in, say, strategy or commercial or business development, charged with some forms of innovation, perhaps in the center of the organization or in a more traditional organization or in some of the business units, and there is this push to, if you like, develop and use corporate venture capital more actively, how easy is it for you to learn and develop yourself? Or is it the case, do you find in your experience, that organizations tend to bring in people from outside to, if you like, supercharge that activity? Can you learn it?
If the question is, can you learn? And the answer is absolutely yes. The question is, how do you go about learning? So what I've seen is 3 different categories. The first category are people that don't have much in terms of relevant background. They don't have previous experience in the space, and they're starting from a really, really basic level of understanding. Now, if they are interested and eager to learn, yes, they can learn it. Second category have probably been in the corporate space quite some time. They have been working in different parts of the organization. They have a good understanding, but they don't have a lot of experience directly with corporate venture capital. So again, they're eager to learn.
Yes.
And the last category that I've also been seeing are people that are being brought in from the outside. So, for example, I was just working with a CVC unit in Detroit, where they had hired one of the most experienced CVC experts in the automotive industry. He probably has 15, 20 years of relevant experience. And the discussion that we had, the conversation we had most recently, it was just like, machine gun Kelly back and forth on the nuances and the details and the term structures and all of these things that you wouldn't really be able to cover with the first 2. And then finally, I saw something interesting done, I believe it was TDK in the US, where they had started a practice to bring in people that had formerly worked in Silicon Valley. So people that had worked as VCs are now being brought in as general partner in resident or various consulting roles, but more being brought in as part-time, full-time advisors. So I think that goes to show that many CVC teams are experimenting with how can we learn faster, how can we bring in various outside voices, and how do we, build a better CVC team faster than what we typically may have done in the past.
And if you bring in your latter 2 categories, if you bring people in from those roles and that sort of general partner type role, they need to be given the space and the mandate to continue doing what they've done, as opposed to what typically happens is they go native very quickly and they revert back to the previous groups. But in each of these examples we're working through, organizations are operating more and more in more open networked ecosystem sort of environments, whether they know it or not. And there are quite a few organizations, when you use the word ecosystem, first you have to explain what it is to them. Secondly, they say, no, I'm not really into that. And then you actually map out their relationships that are either with complementers, or in some cases they're actually orchestrating. And their consciousness of ecosystems is not very high, unless you're clearly one of the big platform players. But again, a broad question that you can dip into and however you like. How does the rise and the prominence of ecosystems change the way that exec teams and boards think about and practice strategy?
Big question, my friend. And I think what you're really opening here is the conversation, ecosystems, what are we actually talking about? Now,
Yes.
the last in-person conference that I had the pleasure of attending, kind of pre-COVID, which is a couple of years back now, was with the wonderful Drucker Forum in Vienna, and the topic was, power of ecosystems. And it was so fascinating as I was going through my notes, because every single speaker spoke about ecosystems, but they all had a different lens, they all had a different perspective, and they all meant to say different things. So I developed this one-page framework that sort of said, 4 typologies of different ecosystems. I haven't done much with it yet, but clearly, David, there's a need to understand what are we actually implying. Now, when I talk about ecosystems, we're really thinking about a sector or an industry where you're looking beyond the traditional value chain. So you're looking much more holistically, trying to integrate many, many more types of partners, type of company, types of people. And you're thinking more loosely or more broadly than just the traditional, again, value chain that you may have been operating alongside. Now, I think that working with ecosystems, understanding ecosystems, and mastering ecosystems is incredibly important, especially for big companies that are kind of morphing into or transforming into new structures. But also, I've been recently, just actually last week, I was developing some new ecosystem frameworks for startup companies, because we're starting to recognize that many startups need to have a better consciousness, if you will, around what is the ecosystem that we're playing in, and how well do we actually understand it. And what I found so far, and again, this is just last week, David, but what I found so far was that the people I've been testing it on, they've been really struggling. Like, we are just an early stage startup. Why should we care about, or how can we even go about caring about ecosystems? So I think we're scratching some surfaces with what are the implications of having strong or weak ecosystems for early stage companies, and that is work in progress.
It focuses the attention on customer needs more than perhaps narrower definitions and structures, because most ecosystems are, again, they permeate in traditional industry boundaries, but they are around ultimately a customer need. But it requires, as you said, a broader and deeper level of consciousness about what are the interactions you need to serve that customer. And I've seen time and time again in different sizes of organizations, not just the large ones, where a strategy process for either a business unit or the organization ignores the ecosystem players around it. So effectively, they come up with a strategy and you say, okay, so who's important for you in delivering that ambition and the choices you've made? And they list out these organizations and you say, so how have they been involved in shaping your thinking? And if I caricature a little bit, it comes back to, once we finished it, we'll take them through what the strategy is and what it means for them. And in the world of more open strategy and in a world of more ecosystems, it makes you wonder they're missing a trick. They're missing quite a few tricks there. But let's move on. Let's move on. You talked earlier about learning in different guises, whether in the world of CVC and so on. And one of the many things you pioneered, and I consider you a pioneer, is the use of simulations to give people the experience, closer to a real life experience of being founder, executive in different guises. And I've partaken in some of that. They are fantastic. They are demanding, challenging, and stimulating simulations. What do they give as an exercise and activity? What do they give to the participants that perhaps other more traditional forms of learning, such as broadcast presentations or the case method, what do they give extra?
You know, David, simulation, or what some people call learning simulations, they've been around for a long time. And I think Harvard Business School, with all their work, have really expanded the use of simulations. But I just think that we can do better. And I think that by creating and shaping and building and bringing these strategy simulations to the world, we can improve how smart people learn. We can improve the power of experiential learning, whether it's in the boardroom or in the classroom. And we can bring a lot of complex content to life by simulation. Now, one of the leading simulation experts in Europe, down in St. Gallen, he said something like, a a good simulation brings a case study to life. I think that was a wonderful, wonderful phrase, because what happens when we work with case studies, David, is that we analyze information and we come up with a recommendation. But in a simulation, you're put into the hot seat of, for example, the management team, and you have to play the part, act the part. You have to make decisions, and in our case, hundreds of decisions that actually make, again, the case study come to life. So, what we've done is that we've written multiple case studies that go along with the simulation, and then the participants step in, they're assigned their various pieces of information, and then they have to act out as the management team, whether they're in the transform strategy simulation, whether they're in the scale-up simulation, or even in the fund manager or supercluster simulation. So simulations, fantastic way to bring complex content to life and also put people into the action instead of just having them read about or listen to the action.
That's a great articulation, and I love the complementarity, because there's a lot of people who want to become more expert in particular roles, and they have that urgency that you talked about right at the beginning of the conversation, or there's a business need for, if you like, the next level of leader to come through the organization, because the succession planning is often a challenge and the pipeline is a challenge. And frankly, shadowing, mentoring is great, but it takes too long. So the question is, how and when and how do you supercharge that development activity? And I think simulations play an important role in that. Chris, one of the things we do in these interviews, as I'm sure you're aware, we talk about not only the topics, but also the individuals, i.e. you. And two questions as we draw to a close that I'd like to cover. I do like to take some risks on Lance We're on the line, hence the term on the line. The first easy one is, how do you measure your own impact in terms of the work that you do in all the different roles? How do you measure your impact?
So that is a more multifaceted question than you may think, David. So one way of answering that is all about reach and impact. Now, that's not something that we measure, as detailed as we could, but how many people do we reach through our social media channels? How many people do we reach through our newsletters? How many people are downloading tools and content from strategy tools on a daily basis? So that is one way of measuring. The other measure is, of course, through, for example, my executive chairman role with Link Venture Capital, where we're really measuring investor returns, portfolio returns. That's a much more straight up financial metric for success. But I think it really comes down to impact and reach, and hopefully being able to distribute a lot of our work to as many people as we possibly can, both through online programs, in-person programs, working with universities and business schools all around the world. So personally, it's all about reach and an impact.
And you are an incredibly generous and welcoming, inclusive person, which many of us are very grateful for, and to you for. And looking ahead, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, looking ahead, David, I have a lot of work left to do. So there's no planning about being remembered just yet. But I have a series of books to be written, and those are sort of work in progress, and I have some urgent deadlines coming up pretty soon. But it's really, again, about the relationships and the people that you work with. Whether it's in a professional setting or if it's in a more of a personal family setting. It all comes down to having good relationships and hopefully being a good part in people's lives.
And if you think about your own habits when you've been on your best professional form, whether it's in one of the simulations, advising a CEO, teaching, being a board member, when you've been your absolutely best, what are the habits that you use that other people could learn from in order to give that peak performance?
Great coaching question you're asking here, David. Well, I've spent a lot of time, and I've been reading, studying, practicing, really about what I call performance optimization. And if I look back at a lot of things that I have done, the patterns are relatively simple. Calendar and timing, enough sleep, sufficient food, sufficient coffee, not too much, not too little. So give you a story from a couple of years ago, or probably about, 14 years ago. I was writing a series of books in Oslo, and during the work week, I would typically work with clients. And the pattern that I found for myself, by trial and error, was for me to have a high productive weekend for writing. It started on Friday afternoon with a good workout, typically basketball at the time. Maybe go out and have dinner with some friends, but call an early night, so typically back home in bed by 10. And then wake up very early Saturday morning, typically around 6:30, 7 Saturday morning, light the fireplace, light meal, coffee, and then I could basically sit by the fireplace and write the whole day well into the late evening. And then I would rinse and repeat. So Saturday by the fireplace, and then Sunday was by desktop computer, going from creative writing to typing writing. And that was basically the pattern, and that allowed some pretty insane productivity sprints over a weekend. And by trial and error, we would find that if I had 2 beers on the Friday, the whole weekend plan would collapse. So
fascinating.
Finely tuned.
I didn't realize you were a lightweight in that way, but anyway, jokes aside, that's fascinating. That's the first thing. And next, I guess now you have family to consider in terms of managing all that. But I love the way you thought about it consciously. That's fantastic. I mean, Chris, this has been a wonderful conversation. We could go on for hours, but I'm conscious of your schedule, which is maxed out in a very carefully orchestrated way. But Chris, I'm grateful for your time. Thank you for today. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. Please do subscribe to the podcast and to the YouTube channel, and do check out the other episodes. Thank you again.